Buddhism Part 6, Early Buddhism. So, the earliest complete collection of Buddhist scriptures or holy texts is called the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is named after Pali, the language that it's composed in. Pali is basically a later form of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the formal version of the language spoken in ancient India from, say, around 1500 BC to maybe almost to 500 BC. By the time you get to 500 BC, Sanskrit has developed into different regional dialects that are called Prakrits. Now, the Buddha was living in the 400s BC, and he did not speak Pali actually, but he spoke a language quite close to Pali. So scholars believe that Pali was a kind of standardized form of spoken Prakrit, the way it was spoken differently in different parts of the country, but it was kind of made into a standard form that was more or less comprehensible to followers of the Buddha who lived, let's say, in Western India, as well as Eastern India, as well as Central India. So this is the language of the Buddhist scriptures. You can see in the photograph on the right a printed edition of the Pali Canon. Originally, the Pali Canon, like the Veda in Hinduism, was transmitted orally. It was repeated from teacher monks to student monks. This is still done today in recitations, but in ancient times, the Pali Canon was written down. And in this modern printed edition, you can see runs to many volumes. So it's so long that it cannot be contained in one physical volume, one physical book. The Pali Canon has three main parts that are together called Tripitaka, or triple basket. So the first Pitaka, or basket, is called the Sutra Pitaka. Sutra is from a word that means thread. It's actually related to the English word suture, but it means a thread of discussion. So a sutra is basically one explanation that the Buddha gave of something. And the Sutra Pitaka basically is the most important part of the Pali Canon in that it has the main teachings of the Buddha. The Vinaya Pitaka relates to the rules that monks are supposed to live by. So this could be translated as the collection of works on discipline. And then there's the Abhidharma Pitaka. This was the last part of the Pali Canon to be assembled. It was probably composed a couple of centuries after the Buddha's death. And what the Abhidharma is, literally it means the further teaching or the higher teaching. It contains an attempt to present systematically a theory of the mind, you might say, and a theory of the universe based on the teachings of the Buddha. So it's doing philosophical metaphysics, or a theory of the nature of reality, and also what corresponds to modern psychology, a theory of the mind and how it operates. The Buddha, according to tradition, his three main students or disciples, who are Ananda, Upali, and Sariputra, according to tradition, each of these three disciples was responsible for memorizing and teaching a different part of the Pali Canon. So Ananda is the one who recited the Sutra Pitaka, Upali is the one who recited the Vinaya Pitaka, and Sariputra, who had a reputation for wisdom, is the one who recited the Abhidharma. So after the death of the Buddha, his monks continued to transmit his teachings through chanting the sutras they had memorized, and also chanting the stories of the Vinaya, or the discipline basket they had memorized. According to tradition, the first council of Buddhist clergy met around 404 BCE in the city of Rajgir, India. And this was to establish a common form of the teachings of the Buddha that all of his followers would use. Now, modern scholars basically believe that some of the Pali Canon does date back to the Buddha himself, but there are portions of it that may have been composed in the century or two after his death. And then there were also commentaries written by later monks still. So probably if there was a recitation, historically speaking, at the first council, it may not have contained every single text that's now part of the Pali Canon. However, there was a relatively standard version of the text circulating among different groups of Buddhists, because we have surviving parts of Buddhist scriptures in Sanskrit that were used by other groups of Buddhists who didn't use the Pali version, and they're pretty close to what we see in the Pali version. There was a second council or assembly of the senior Buddhist clergy at Vaishali around 334 BCE, and this was convened to resolve a disagreement about whether monks could accept essentially cash donations, donations of gold and silver coins, as opposed to food and the other things that monks are allowed to receive from lay people. And basically this sometimes happens because there are lay people who want to give resources to Buddhist monks and they want to make a cash donation. Well, after the council assembled, the monks decided, no, this is not allowed. The Buddha pretty specifically forbids that in the rules for monks. As a kind of side note, a lot of Buddhist monasteries nowadays will accept cash donations, but typically they have a lay person who works for the monastery, who's the one who actually gets the money. It's not supposed to actually be something that the monks themselves handle. However, after this dispute was resolved at Vaishali, another dispute among the senior clergy broke out that they were not able to resolve. The new dispute was about whether arhants, these are saints who become awakened by following the teaching of a Buddha, do they have the same level or degree of enlightenment as a Buddha? Also, there was a question about whether lay people could become fully enlightened or only monks. And this led to a split in the Buddhist clergy. The two main factions that grew out of this were called the Mahasangika and the Sthaviravada. Mahasangika means great Sangha or great assembly. And their view was that arhants, their level of enlightenment is actually less than that of a full Buddha. There is some kind of wisdom that a full Buddha has that an arhat does not have. As a reminder, the Buddha is someone who discovers the path to awakening and then teaches it to others. The arhat is following in the footsteps of the Buddha. And then the Mahasangikas also taught that lay people can become enlightened. You don't have to become formally ordained as a monk in order to attain bodhi or awakening. Sthaviravada means the teaching or doctrine of the elders, and that's a reference to the elder or senior monks. And their view was the more traditional one, that historically speaking was probably closer to what the Buddha taught. But their view is that lay people can get very close to full awakening. This is actually spelled out in the Pali Canon exactly what level of attainment they can get. But they cannot get the full awakening unless they ordain as a monk and live that lifestyle. The Sthaviravada monks also taught that the awakening of an arhat is of the same basic nature as that of a Buddha, even though the Buddha performs this kind of more cosmic function by introducing the Dharma, how to attain awakening, to a whole world. A really important figure in the early history of Buddhism was King Ashoka. He was one of the kings of the Maurya dynasty, the first to create an empire that included all of the Aryan kingdoms of India. He succeeded King Chandragupta. Chandragupta had supported Jainism primarily, and Ashoka, in the middle of his life, basically converted to Buddhism, according to the traditional story that's told about this. He had actually expanded the empire of the Mauryas greatly by conquering southern India. And he killed a lot of people as a result of his wars in the south. After doing this, though, he regretted killing so many. He regretted that loss of life and violence. And he basically tried to commit himself to ruling by the principles of Buddhism. Now, historically speaking, he probably also supported other groups of shramanas or other religions and sects, not just Buddhism, but he's become most associated with Buddhism specifically. He tried to rule by ethical principles, and he erected pillars all across India that include his pronouncements and laws in many different languages to try to communicate with his different subjects. He was regarded by later Buddhists as an ideal ruler. So they call him a Chakravartin. A Chakravartin, this concept goes back to the time of the Buddha or before. It literally means a wheel turner. It's a reference to a king who basically rules the whole world or a large part of it. They can basically drive or go wherever they want in their chariot, metaphorically, and it's still going to be their land. And the idea is a Chakravartin is someone who's kind of like cosmically destined to rule and to support the Dharma. This is something that later Buddhist kings would also aspire to be. But Ashoka is regarded as just such a wheel-turning king. And one of Ashoka's actions in reference to Buddhism was dividing up the relics of the Buddha that had originally been buried under 8 primary stupas. He dug them up and then divided them into smaller bits that could be shared in different parts of the country. And this is one of the ways that people rationalize the idea that there are relics of the Buddha far away from northern India where Buddha lived. So for example, there's a relic of the Buddha's tooth in Sri Lanka, the island off the south coast of India. Early in its history, Buddhism did not use sculptures or images of the Buddha himself. So this is what scholars of religion call an aniconic religion, a religion that does not use icons or images. They did use some visual symbols, such as the Triratna. The Triratna symbolizes the triple gem, or rather, the Triratna is the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, that is symbolized by the Trisula, or trident shape. The Vajra, as I mentioned previously in a previous lecture, is a symbol of the power of a Buddha's wisdom. It's like as hard as a diamond, as forceful as a bolt of lightning. That's how much spiritual power a Buddha has. And then the Dharma wheel, which you can see at the bottom of this image in the center of the slide, represents the teaching of the Buddha, specifically the Four Noble Truths in their 3 aspects. You can also see the Trisula, Vajra, and Dharma wheel at the bottom of this footprint of the Buddha on the right. The footprint of the Buddha was the main image used of him early in the history of the religion. And it's basically symbolizing the principle that Buddhists should follow in the footsteps of the Buddha. If they want to attain awakening, they have to walk the same path that he did, metaphorically speaking. The fact that there's a Dharma wheel in the center of the palm of the Buddha's footprint is also due to a tradition that the Buddha had kind of like lines on the bottom of his feet that were in the same shape as a Dharma wheel. So another interesting development in the history of Buddhism in the early centuries after the Buddha's death was the establishment of some dynasties of Greek-speaking kings in northern and western India. So there was the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and also the Indo-Greek kingdom. These kings were basically descendants of the generals of Alexander the Great, who was from Macedonia, a kingdom just to the north of Greece. But he conquered Greece, and most of his army and generals were ethnically Greek. After Alexander died, his empire broke up, but one of his generals became a ruler of the eastern part of Alexander's empire, which corresponded to northern and northwestern India. So one of these kings, King Milinda, was an Indo-Greek king, and he basically became a supporter of Buddhism. And there's a famous dialogue called the Questions of King Milinda, in which he asks questions of Nagasena. Nagasena was a famous Buddhist monk of this period who was also regarded as a great scholar of Buddhism. So King Milinda summoned Nagasena to visit him in his palace and asked him questions about the religion. So one of the most famous teachings to come out of this dialogue involved a use of a metaphor of a chariot to express the not-self teaching of Buddhism. According to Nagasena, the word self is just a conventional label for the 5 aggregates, the 5 kind of dimensions or channels of our experience. things that include the forms of perception, sense perception, feelings of pleasant, painful, and neutral sensation, etc. And according to Nagasena, what the not self teaching means is that the self is not an ultimately real thing. What we call the self is really just a conventional label for these 5 different types of experience. And he compares it to using the word chariot to refer to a collection of physical elements that have a kind of functional relationship with each other. So if you think about the nature of a chariot, it has many different parts, like wheels and an axle pole, etc., a carriage for the rider to be in. And if you dig down deeper, you can find these parts are made up of atoms, we would say today. Now, in ancient India, including ancient Buddhists, they also had a theory of atoms. It was not the same as the modern scientific theory, but it was a similar idea. And so what Nagasena is saying, just as the chariot is a convenient way of referring to this collection of physical bits, the word self is just a convenient label. Now, this was a bit different, at least in emphasis, to the way the Buddha had talked about the not-self teaching. If you go to the Pali Canon, it seems more like a strategy to avoid taking up a self-view as a way of avoiding suffering. But this more metaphysical or philosophical interpretation of not-self became very influential for later Buddhist thought. Nagasena is also drawing upon this distinction between conventional and ultimate reality. So conventional reality is reality based on human custom, whereas ultimate reality is the way things are, regardless of what humans think or say about it. So in the analogy, the atoms of a chariot are the ultimate reality, and the fact that we recognize all those atoms as one object is just a conventional reality. And so, according to many schools of Buddhist thought, the self is only a conventional reality. It doesn't have an ultimate existence behind it.